for joining me for today's craft night from the Makery. For today's craft, I am going to show you how to make necklaces using epoxy resin to make the necklace pendants. We had a limited number of kits available for pickup at the drive-up window on a first-come, first-served basis, which included the supplies needed for this craft. If you were unable to get the kit, or if you were just interested in making more of your own crafts, we have a list of the supplies in the description of this video. I do recommend watching this video at least once before you get started. I am going to go over a variety of safety tips you need to know with some of these supplies. And I'm also going to go over a couple different techniques with the resin. So you'll want to see what options you have before you start using your resin. So let's get started. If you were able to get one of our kits, it should include a Ziploc bag that has a necklace cord, some jump rings, one metal frame, one silicone mold, and a piece of parchment paper with a piece of blue tape on it. It should also include a silicone mixing cup, 10 milliliters of resin dye of a random color, 30 milliliters of UV resin, and a UV flashlight. We did not include the 3 AAA batteries needed to power this flashlight, so you will need to supply your own. Also not included in the kit that you'll need for this project are Nitrile Gloves, a lighter, preferably with a long neck, and then something to mix your resin with. I'm using a toothpick today. You can also use a popsicle stick. And I do recommend having some nail polish remover or alcohol nearby to help clean up any messes. And then additionally, you can get other stuff or find items lying around your house to use with your resin to make it more customizable or embellished. So for instance, they sell some kits that include glitter. So we put some in this sample here. Or you can get metal pieces to embed into your resin. You can also get pressed flowers that you can embed into your resin. And then they also have these sheets of paper decals you can cut out and place into the resin as well. If you're going to get any of these additional stuff to put in your resin, I recommend having tweezers because they'll help you place the items inside. Before we officially get started, I want to go over some of the science and safety behind using epoxy resin. There are a bunch of resources you can read online, so this is just going to cover some of the basics. The resin we supplied to you is a pre-mixed resin being stored in this opaque black bottle. Usually when you buy resin, it's sold unmixed in 2 separate bottles, an epoxy resin and an epoxy hardener. And when you mix the 2 equal parts and expose it to light, it has an exothermic reaction where the liquid starts to heat up and becomes a hard, solid plastic. The resin we supplied to you is already pre-mixed. The only thing preventing it from having a chemical reaction is the fact that the black bottle is blocking the light. So the second this resin leaves the bottle, it's going to start its chemical reaction and heat up. That being said, it's very important that you protect yourself properly from the resin. So that means wearing gloves, preferably nitrile. And we recommend having long sleeves on, but if you do spill on your clothes, it's going to leave a permanent stain, so be aware of that. We also recommend having safety goggles or glasses on to protect your eyes. And then because the resin has this chemical reaction, it is going to give off some fumes. So it's really important that you're using this in a well-ventilated space, preferably with a window open or a fan on. And it's always recommended that you wear a mask, preferably a respirator, during your project. Now the time it takes for this to cure depends on the type of light it's exposed to. If you're using this in just regular indoor lighting, it could take a couple hours. If you're using this in direct sunlight, it's usually about 45 minutes. And if you're using the UV flashlight that we supplied to you, it's usually only about 4 minutes. Now, a couple safety tips about the UV flashlight. This flashlight is not intended for sanitation purposes. It's not strong enough, but it is still a UV flashlight. So you want to make sure that you are not pointing this flashlight at your eyes or at your skin. So you want to make sure you're protecting your hands again with those gloves when you're using the flashlight. Something to also consider, in order for the chemical reaction to occur, you cannot dilute the epoxy resin too much. So for instance, the dye that we supplied to you is way more than you need for the project we're working on. You really only need like 1 or 2 drops per pendant. If you use too much dye when you're mixing the resin, you can dilute the resin and it will have a hard time curing. I do want to mention that if you spill at any time, you can use things like nail polish remover or alcohol to clean any spills. There's more information about that online that you can find. And then because you can leave permanent stains, you want to make sure that you are covering your workspace properly and covering it with something that can handle the heat of the resin. So we recommend a canvas drop cloth. You want to avoid anything that's plastic on your workspace, because the plastic will often melt due to the heat from the resin. Additionally, you want to make sure that you're using wooden stirring materials. So that's why I'm using a toothpick, or you can use a popsicle stick. You want to avoid a plastic spoon or other plastic utensils that might not be able to handle the heat well. I also want to mention that the tape we supplied to you and the metal frame are one-time use only. So you want to set these aside until you're ready to use them for your final project. The silicone molds and the silicone mixing utensils are unique and highly recommended to use because they can withstand the heat of the resin. You cannot just use any mold with your resin. If it's not the right type of plastic, the plastic will melt during the exothermic reaction. The nice thing about the silicones is that not only can it withstand the heat, but you can actually reuse these. So what you would do is mix your resin, cure it with your flashlight, and then peel off the resin from these molds or the mixing cup, and then you can reuse them as many times as you want. The resin we supplied to you is enough to make about 3 or 4 different pendants. So I recommend doing 2 or 3 practices with your silicone mold before using your metal frame. And if you have any extra resin, you can pour it into your mixing cup and cure it with your flashlight, peel it off, and dispose of it. You never want to dispose of liquid resin in a garbage or down the drain. You have to cure the resin first and harden it into a solid before disposing of it. If you're unable to do the curing process yourself, you want to seek a hazard waste company to give them the liquid leftovers you have. Now that I've gone over all of the safety, let's actually start making our pendants. So now I'm going to show you a couple of different ways to use your resin. So as a reminder, your metal frame and tape are one-time use only. So I'm going to set these aside so we can use them later. Your silicone mold is reusable, so I'm going to do a couple different techniques using this. I recommend using it as your practice. And I'm just going to show you how to first use the resin without adding any dyes, just so you can kind of see the process, and then show you different techniques. You are going to need your lighter. And so to get started, I recommend taking your resin and shaking it for about 30 seconds to make sure it's well mixed. And after you've shaken it to make sure it's good, what you can do is remove the twist off cap. And you're going to take your resin and you're just going to pour and squeeze into the silicone mold. You want to try and make sure you're applying evenly. So you can move it around and really fill it in. And having a even surface is really beneficial, so that way you don't have a lopsided pendant. And if you notice areas where it's not as even, you have a couple different ways you can level it out. You can tilt your silicone mold to let gravity move the resin in spots, or you can take your toothpick and you can help push resin into areas where it might not be filling properly. After you make sure that it's all filled in, you want to make sure it's on a level surface, so you have a level top. And you will notice some air bubbles. So at this point, you want to grab your lighter and you want to wave it over your resin lightly, and this should help the air bubbles pop. Once those air bubbles have popped, you're ready to start the curing process. So you're going to grab your flashlight, turn it on, and point it directly at your resin, and you need to keep it pointed at the resin for about 4 minutes. After the 4 minutes are up, you can turn your flashlight off. The resin might still be hot from the exothermic reaction, so to make sure it's a solid, you can grab your toothpick or popsicle stick and you can poke at it to make sure it has solidified. And then I recommend letting it sit for like a minute or two to cool off, and then we're gonna pop it out of the mold. Once you've waited a minute or two for it to cool off, you can begin removing it from the mold. So the way to do that is you can pinch around your mold to start separating it along the border. And then you can put one of your fingers under the mold and kind of push it out. What I recommend doing often is flipping it over so the backside of your pendant is exposed, and so you have your mold emptied. And I recommend shooting the UV light for about another minute just to make sure that any of those bottom layers are properly cured, or to clean out and finish using the mold. Another technique is to pour your resin into your silicone mixing cup and mix dye in and mix it so it's all a consistent color. So after shaking your resin, you're going to remove the nozzle, pour it into your silicone mixing cup, you're then going to open your dye, and if this is your first time using it, you might need to snip off the top. And you want to use only 1 or 2 drops, because again, if you use too much, it will dilute the resin. And then you want to start mixing so it colors your dye evenly. And then after mixing, so your resin is evenly colored, you can pour it into your mold. Make sure your mold is evenly filled in. Grab your lighter and heat away some of those air bubbles. And then set your resin by using your flashlight for 4 minutes. After 4 minutes, you can turn off your flashlight, set this aside to cool off, and then since I have leftover resin in my mixing cup, what I'm going to do is cure the resin in this mixing cup and also the resin that got on my toothpick. So I'm going to cure this for 4 minutes, and then we're going to peel it off of the mixing cup. After curing both your silicone mold and your silicone mixing cup, you can remove the resin. Same thing with this. I recommend using your UV flashlight on the bottom for about a minute. And then for your mixing cup, it should be cured after using your flashlight. And you can remove it or peel it off. You never want to put liquid resin down the drain or in a garbage. So always cure your extra, wait till it's in solid form, and then toss it in the garbage. The next technique I'm going to show you is filling your mold with clear resin and then coloring it using your dye by swirling it in. For this, I recommend having a clean toothpick. It works a little bit better. So again, shake your resin, open up the nozzle, and pour an even layer. And then you're going to take your toothpick and you're going to open your dye. And what I recommend doing is kind of pushing your toothpick into the opening of your dye and kind of getting drops of dye on the tip of your toothpick, and then using that to kind of swirl in to your resin. You do need to be careful that you're not getting resin on the nozzle of your bottle, your dye. Once it's swirled in, you can close up your dye. You still want to use your lighter to get bubbles out. And then you want to set the resin by using your flashlight for 4 minutes. After you shoot the UV flashlight for 4 minutes and then let it cool off for an additional minute or two, you can remove your resin with the swirled in dye. Now, this is one of the more trickier techniques because sometimes the dye at the top layer doesn't harden. So you might need to clean off extra dye with a wipe or a little bit of alcohol. Or another way you can fix this is by adding another layer of clear resin on top to seal that dye in. So I'm gonna remove this just like the other one. And then after removing it from the silicone mold, you can use your flashlight on the back side for another minute, and also to make sure any residue in the silicone mold has hardened. So you can also use resins in layers. So in this case, I'm gonna mix blue into some resin, and I am going to fill the bottom half of my mold, cure it in place, and then fill the top half clear. So I'm gonna get started. Pour it in and try to keep it at the base of my mold. I'm still going to use my lighter to get some of these air bubbles out. And I'm going to use my UV flashlight for 4 minutes to set this portion of the resin solid. Now that this first part is cured, I'm just going to go ahead and pour directly in my clear resin, and I'm going to fill the rest of this mold and try and make sure that the top layer is even. I'm gonna use my lighter to get those air bubbles out. And I'm going to use my flashlight to set the resin. Once you've cured that second layer, you can cure the rest of your resin left over in your silicone mold so you can reuse it. So now that they're cured, you should be able to peel them out. And so the 4 techniques I've shown you so far shows you how to use it with just clear resin, equally colored resin mixed in your cup, swirled in color, and then like a 2-tone layered effect. After you're done using your resin, you want to make sure that any of the liquid resin is cured with your UV flashlight. And then you can clean them even further by taking some nail polish remover, getting a paper towel wet, and just cleaning off some of that extra dye and resin that lingers. I wanted to show you how you can add some other items into your resin if you decide to buy some of these decorations. For these types of projects, I recommend having tweezers available. So what I'm going to do real quick is show you how to use the glitter. What I actually recommend is pouring it into your silicone mixing cup, adding a tiny bit of glitter, and mixing it like you did with your dye so it's nice and even, and pouring it into your mold. for this step, you want to be really careful if you're going to use your lighter, because some glitter will melt. So I usually recommend avoiding the lighter for this step. And then for the pressed flowers, you're going to fill your mold with your resin. And for both of these techniques, you can use dyes too. I'm just using clear resin just to make this a little more simple. And you want to pick up your pressed flowers with your tweezers and place them into your mold. And you can layer them if you want. So I'm going to gently push this down into the resin and make sure it's fully submerged. And for this one, I'm going to take this pink flower and place that in as well, and push it down until it's submerged. And we're also going to cure these two for 4 minutes each. If you're going to add something that has some weight to it, for example, this metal gear, I recommend applying your resin in layers. Otherwise, when you drop this into the resin, it's going to sink to the very bottom and end up at the base of your pendant. So for this, you want to fill a very thin base layer. After applying a base layer, you can go ahead and drop your item into your mold and then fill it up the rest of the way. And then let it set. And by doing this 2-layer method, it's going to prevent those heavier items from sinking to the bottom, so it will actually be suspended in the middle of your pendant. Now that I've shown you all the different techniques with epoxy resin, you'll want to decide which technique you want to use with your wireframe. For this step, what I recommend doing is cleaning off everything that you've used, including your surface, so that way everything's clean and there's no resin, and then taking your gloves off so you can handle the tape easier. So what you want to do is peel the tape off, and you want to place the tape down on your work surface with the sticky side up. And what you want to do is take your metal frame and place it on your tape. And you want to make sure that your metal frame is fully covered by that tape. And what you want to do is press down so the tape is nice and secured to the base of your frame. This tape is specifically meant for UV resin. And by doing this, what we're going to do is fill our metal frame, and the seal around the base on the tape is going to prevent it from leaking outwards. You're now ready to put your gloves back on and start using the resin technique of your choice. After it's cured, you can peel the tape off. Unfortunately, in my case, I ended up with an air bubble on the back side. So I'm going to try fixing that by filling it in with a little bit of resin and curing the back side one more time. Once the resin for your metal frame has cured and cooled off, you're ready to connect it to your necklace cord. For this step, I recommend using pliers if you have some lying around the house. Otherwise, the jump rings resupplied to you are large enough that you should be able to open them with your hands. When you open the jump rings, you never want to open them outwards. This is going to cause the jump ring to misshapen and sometimes even crack. What you want to do is take your jump ring and you want to twist them open and then twist it back close. So what I'm going to do is grab my pliers. I like using 2, 1 in each hand. I'm going to grab my jump ring. I'm going to hold each side of the jump ring with my pliers. and I'm going to twist the jump ring open. So you're going to have kind of a curly Q, and you're going to feed it through your metal frame, place your necklace cord inside, and you're going to twist it close. And so there you should have your finished necklace. If you don't have pliers, you can also do this by hand. The only issue with doing this by hand is you're more likely to misshapen the jump ring. So just like with the pliers, you're gonna grab either side of your jump ring and you're gonna twist it open to get that curled look. Feed it through and then twist it close. The jump rings we supplied to you are just about large enough to work with the pendants you made with your silicone mold. The silicone molds are rather thick, where you might have problems with the circular jump rings. If that's the case, we recommend that you get the jump rings that are triangle shaped. We hope you enjoyed following along the instructions for making the necklace resin pendants. If your resin has a little bit of stickiness to it, there's a couple troubleshoot options you have. The easiest is to take your pendants and set them on a windowsill in direct sunlight for 24 hours. The other option is you can sand your resin and apply another layer of epoxy, or you can get resin spray and spray it off to seal it up. We also wanted to show you different ways you can incorporate resin with Makery equipment. For instance, this piece of wood was created by carving into the wood with the Makery's Carvey. We uploaded a JPEG into the easel software, carved it in 1/4 inch, poured in our resin, let it harden, and then sanded, stained, and sealed to the wood. We also made a custom pendant with the laser cutter. To do this, we created a vector file using Inkscape, and we cut the design out of the wood. And after the design was cut out, we poured in resin to create this inlay, sanded it, sealed it, and connected it to the necklace. So these are just a couple ways you can incorporate resin with Makery equipment. We really hope you enjoyed today's video, and have a nice day.